What's the matter? I can't get into the dive gap because I'm in angle mode, so I can't flip upside down. I can't see into the dive gap, and it's costing me probably half a second on every lap. I've been hearing a lot about that, especially with the more complicated obstacles people are putting into whoop races these days. A lot of top-level pilots are switching to acro mode. Maybe you could try that. Because if I fly in acro mode, then anytime I bounce off a gate or touch the wall, then I just completely lose control and crash out. And that's not gonna help me win races. Well, actually, Betaflight has a feature called crash recovery, which lets the flight controller automatically detect when you've hit an obstacle, quickly right the quadcopter, and then put you back in control. Really? That could be super useful, even for bigger quads. Why does nobody use this? I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're gonna learn something today. And the funny thing is, I didn't even make that up for the sake of this video. It's true, lots of top tiny whoop racing pilots are switching from angle to acro mode. But before we talk about why that is and how to use Betaflight's crash recovery, let's just examine why we were bothering to fly in angle mode in the first place. Isn't angle mode like for babies or DJI pilots? Now I know some of you guys already know this, but for those who maybe are new, in angle mode, when the stick is centered, the quad returns to basically flat and level. And there's gonna be a little bit of drift because we're outside and there might be wind, and the accelerometer may not be perfectly calibrated, but when I center the stick, the quad goes back to flat and level and basically slows down. And when I deflect the stick forward, the quad pitches forward. When I move the stick to the right, the quad rolls to the right. But the key thing here is that the deflection of the stick corresponds to the angle that the quad is away from flat and level. And the reason that's so important for tiny whoop racing is, well, first of all, it's just easier to control a twitchy, fast-moving, lightweight aircraft in angle mode. If you start to kind of get out of control, you just kind of recenter the stick and it comes back into control. And that's why beginners and DJI pilots prefer to fly in angle mode. But there's something else much more significant, and it has to do with how the quadcopter acts when it smacks an obstacle. In order to demonstrate that, I'm going to intentionally smack an obstacle, and I want you to see what happens. Two points. Couldn't have done that on purpose if I'd have tried. Did you see how when the quadcopter smacked into the obstacle, it immediately self-righted itself? You see, in angle mode, the flight controller is trying to use the motors to hold the quadcopter at a certain angle. And when the quadcopter deviates from that angle, say because it smacked into an obstacle, the flight controller corrects it back to that angle faster than your human reflexes could ever hope to recover. And we usually think of that angle in angle mode as being flat and level, but it depends on the stick position. Whatever stick position you're inputting is corresponding to a certain angle, and the flight controller will just try to stay at that angle. What that means is that when you're flying in angle mode and you hit an obstacle, as you so often do when you're flying a tiny whoop, the flight controller gets you back on track way better than your human reflexes could. Now let's go into the Betaflight CLI, and we're going to type set crash_recovery equals on, and then type the word save to save that change. And that is it. You have enabled this, I kind of want to call it a secret feature of Betaflight, because it seems like almost nobody's heard of it, except it's been in Betaflight since Betaflight 3.2, and people have made videos about it, and I've used it too. I'll tell you a little later in the video why I think it never really came into vogue, but first let's just see what it does. This time we're going to take it out of angle mode and fly it in acro mode. Not in the pool. Do you see how it leveled itself out there? It kind of flipped over and leveled itself out. That wasn't me. Let's see if I can do it again, but not in the pool. See, it leveled itself out there. I didn't do that. If we go out here and we just try and tap one of these. Oh, missed it. I'm too good, boy. I'm too good. Oh, see? There, it did it again. See how it leveled itself out? That's not me doing that. That's 100% the quad. There, 100% the quad. There, that, oh, so go, so it's still got away from me, but it's hanging in there. Okay. I can't think of a better demonstration of this feature than what just happened there, because it was literally leveling itself back out again before I even knew anything had happened. And it feels a lot like when you're flying in angle mode and you tap something and the quad recovers, but you're flying in acro mode the whole time. It's like the best of both worlds, isn't it? It's kind of like the best of both worlds. Now, if that just told you about a new feature of Betaflight that you never heard of before, if that just changed how you're going to approach whoop racing, would you mind going down and hitting the like button? Because more people need to know about this. And the best thing you can do to help more people know about this is tell YouTube this is a good video by hitting the like button. I sure would appreciate it. Now, the next thing I want to do is tell you about how to fine tune this, because as you can imagine, if this was to trigger when you weren't actually crashing, it would be kind of bad. And there's a couple of options that you're going to want to know about. Let's go downstairs in the air conditioning and talk about it at the computer. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that this feature came out a long time ago and kind of fell into obscurity. And this section of the video is where we're going to talk about why I think that happened. Because I remember when it first came out, I remember thinking that it was super cool, and I remember people trying it. And what I remember is they moved away from it because there were issues. Issues like it would trigger when it wasn't supposed to trigger, so you'd be flying along and you'd do like a snap roll or something, and suddenly it would crash recover and it would turn you right side up when you didn't intend to do that. Or you would like hit a wall and then it would kind of just go and just kind of get confused and yaw spin into oblivion. There are some things we can do to try to tune the way this feature performs to prevent these issues, and that's what this section of the video is going to be about. And these parameters are all in the Betaflight command line, and the first thing I want to do is just type get crash underscore, and I believe that should give us all of the parameters that could be used to tune and configure this feature. I do want to say, if this feels like a little overwhelming, or maybe you just don't want to deal with it today, it's, especially with a tiny whoop, it's pretty safe to just try turning it on. All I know is there are more than a few tiny whoop pilots who are trying this out today, and I haven't heard any reports of anything super bad happening. So either it's gotten better or we haven't reached a critical mass of people who will find problems with it yet. Maybe once people start trying it out on 5 inches, suddenly the problems will come back. I don't know. But you could just give it a try, especially on a tiny whoop where the stakes are relatively low. Let's take a look at these parameters though. And the first parameter is crash recovery. That determines whether this feature is off, whether it is on. You can also have the option to beep. And if you set crash recovery equals beep, then instead of doing crash recovery, it will just beep when it would have done crash recovery. This is useful for testing if you want to make sure it's not going to trigger accidentally, but don't take a risk of like having the quad do something unintended. Bear in mind that you will need an actual beeper on your quad. You can't be using D-shot motor beeper while you're flying because the motors have to be flying. They can't be beeping. So on a tiny whoop, this is basically going to be useless because tiny whoops almost never, I don't think they ever have like onboard beepers. But for a larger quad with an onboard beeper, this might be useful. And then the other option is disarm. If you enable this, then instead of doing crash recovery, it will just disarm and fall out of the air. But maybe that's better than it just freaking out and flying into somebody's hair or something. At least you'll know what happened. Next, we're going to take a look at these three parameters: crash D threshold, crash G threshold, and crash set point threshold. And these parameters are used to tune how sensitive the flight controller is to thinking that you're crashing and taking over and righting the quadcopter. If you were getting false alerts where it triggered and righted the quad when you didn't actually want it to, you could tune these parameters. Crash set point threshold is used to prevent crash recovery from kicking in when you are doing flips and rolls. And the idea is that if you are doing a snap, flip, or roll, the quadcopter is supposed to be rotating rapidly, and we shouldn't misinterpret that as a crash. So if we go back here to the rate profile tab, we can see that the max rate for the current rates is 670 degrees per second. And as you deflect the stick more and more, the set point, or how fast the quadcopter is supposed to be rotating, will go between 0 and 670 degrees per second. The way that crash set point threshold works is if the current set point based on your stick deflection is more than this threshold, then crash recovery will not kick in. So crash set point threshold is based on your stick position, which is how fast you are wanting the quadcopter to go. Crash G threshold is based on your gyro reading, which is how fast the quadcopter is actually spinning. Crash recovery will not trigger unless the quadcopter is spinning faster than crash G threshold. So in this case, it's set to 400 degrees per second, but if we go back to my rates tab, you can see my max rate is around 600 degrees per second. In other words, in theory, I could exceed this threshold and trigger crash recovery even while doing a normal move. That brings us to our next parameter, crash D threshold, which is a threshold for the D term. The idea is that when the quadcopter is doing what it's told to do, the value of the P, the I, and the D term will be relatively low. And the D term specifically is going to aggressively detect and respond to cases where the quadcopter is crashing. That's the gist of it. So the idea is that if the D term is below this D threshold, then don't trigger crash recovery. But if the D term goes above this threshold, then potentially you could trigger crash recovery. If you're interested in tuning these, it's going to be tricky to do without black box, and most tiny whoops don't have black box logging capability. But if you are interested in tuning these, one way to approach it is to set the crash set point threshold to something a little bit less than your max rate. Set the crash G threshold to something close to your max rate, and leave the D threshold alone unless you want to go into black box and look at how high your D value actually is during normal flights and tune that threshold. But most people probably aren't going to go to the trouble to do that. Crash delay is used to add just a little bit of delay between the moment the crash recovery triggers and the actual commencement of the crash recovery behavior. One way you might use this is to give the quadcopter just a little bit of time to bounce off the obstacle before it actually tries to kick itself upright. In theory, you could increase this value to try to give you a chance to sort of get it back under control manually, but most people probably aren't going to have reflexes that fast. The value for crash delay is in milliseconds, and it can be between 0 and 500, which is 0 and half a second. Crash time is the maximum amount of time that the quadcopter will attempt to recover. And the idea here is it's going to try and level out, but if let's say you lost a prop when you hit the wall, and so the whole time it's trying to level out, it's just it's not going to happen. So the idea is that if it doesn't recover within a certain amount of time, it should just give up and let the quadcopter do whatever it's going to do, probably crash. Crash time is also in milliseconds, and it can be anywhere from 100 milliseconds to 5,000 milliseconds. Crash recovery rate is how fast the quadcopter will attempt to rotate when it tries to recover. The higher this number, sort of the harder it's going to, get back in there. Or, yeah, we'll try to recover. It's how hard it's going to push the motors. The default is 100. You could try turning it up and see if it recovers quicker. But if you turn it too high, it may try too hard and get into oscillations and other bad things. I thought it was pretty smooth. In fact, it was almost unnoticeable while I was flying it. Crash limit yaw was introduced to solve an early problem with crash recovery where sometimes it would get into yaw spins. And the idea is that if during crash recovery the yaw rate exceeds this number in degrees per second, so 200 degrees per second, then crash recovery is canceled. I don't see any reason why you would need to raise that, but if you found that it wasn't recovering from yaw spins, then maybe you could raise that. And then we've got crash recovery angle, which is how many degrees off of horizontal it will try to recover to. The default is it will try to recover to within 10 degrees of horizontal before it stops crash recovery and gives you control again. So those are all the parameters that can be used to tune crash recovery. But again, I just would encourage you to just try it, test it somewhere safe, and see if you think it's working for you. I was really impressed with it. I need to thank Evan Turner. Evan Turner heads up FPV, one of the fastest racing pilots pilots, probably in the world. I saw him at a whoop race, and he was racing in acro mode, and he was using this feature, and that's what inspired me to give it another look. But there are many tiny whoop pilots trying out acro mode, and I think a lot of them would like to know about this feature. If you're one of them, if you try it out, let me know down in the comments how it worked for you. Did it work, or did you have problems with it? And if you solved them, or if you want to know how to solve them, feel free to ask. If you're a top tiny whoop racer, one of the things you're always concerned about is your lap times, and you can't get great lap times without healthy batteries. And one of the things I've noticed is that most tiny whoop pilots don't put their batteries into storage mode. I want to refer you to this video, which is a review of the VFly Whoop Store Charger. I've been using it in this video and all my whoop videos lately, and it is an amazing tiny whoop charger, about 25 bucks, and it has storage mode, and that's one of the things that makes it stand out. If you want to know more about it, I'll put a card to that video on screen. The other thing I want to tell you about is the batteries I'm using are the Nubidro Nitro Nectar, and they are, I would argue, the best tiny whoop batteries you can buy today, and I've got a review of them. I'll put a link to that on screen as well. I'll see you in one of those videos. Happy flying.